What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
Every year, I was cropped out or forgotten, and I can still hear myself saying those exact words in my head like a broken record, because that was the rhythm of my life whenever it came to family gatherings, milestones, or even the simplest snapshots that were supposed to capture all of us together. It started when I was younger, and at first I thought it was an accident, like maybe Aunt Carol just didn't know how to center the picture properly, or maybe Uncle Jim's shaky hands cut me off at the edges. But then as the years went on and I saw the same pattern repeat itself, me cut out of the frame, or worse, not even invited to stand in the group shot, I realized it wasn't clumsy photography. It was intentional, a quiet erasure that became the family's running habit, and when I'd point it out, they'd laugh, say I was being dramatic, or throw in a half-hearted oops, next time we'll get you in. But there was never a next time. The sting of it wasn't just that I wasn't in the pictures, it was how those pictures became the evidence of who mattered in the family and who didn't. They would post the photos online, frame them for Grandma's mantle, send them out as Christmas cards, and there it would be, the happy, smiling faces of cousins, siblings, and uncles all lined up like one big, proud unit, while I was cropped away or conveniently not around according to the captions. I remember one Christmas in particular when they handed out the holiday cards they'd made. Everyone had received theirs in the mail weeks before except me, and when I finally saw one at Grandma's house, it was a group shot from Thanksgiving where I knew I'd been sitting at the far right. I looked for myself in the picture, and sure enough, my body had been cut clean off, replaced with a blurry edge of the curtain. Nobody even blinked, nobody apologized, and when I tried to joke about it, saying, "Wow, looks like I don't exist," my cousin smirked and muttered, "Well, you always do your own thing anyway." That was the closest I ever got to acknowledgement. It's funny, because you'd think after so many years I'd grow numb to it, like you eventually stop noticing the same bruise on your arm after bumping it 100 times. But I didn't stop noticing, I just got angrier. Every wedding, every graduation, every barbecue, there would be this constant awareness in my head. Watch how they'll leave you out, watch how they'll make you the afterthought, and sure enough, they always did. Even when I had moments worth celebrating, like graduating early from college or landing my first real job, those never made it into the slideshow of family pride. Meanwhile, my cousins could pass a single class, and suddenly there was a family brunch, a post online, and Grandma's delighted retelling of the story to anyone who would listen. I didn't hate them for being celebrated, not really. What I hated was how invisible I was to the people who were supposed to know me best. It's one thing to feel unrecognized by strangers at work, but when your own blood acts like you're the ghost in the room, it does something permanent to your sense of self. And year after year, when the holidays rolled around, I'd brace myself for the newest version of being forgotten. Maybe it would be a photo where I was conveniently blocked by someone taller, maybe a family group chat where my name never came up. Or maybe it was Grandma bragging to the neighbors about everyone else's promotions or marriages, but never mentioning the fact that I was working my ass off building a business. The truth is, I started to expect it, and that expectation turned into resentment. I'd scroll through my phone, looking at those cropped family photos they'd posted online, and feel like I was watching a life I wasn't really part of, even though I had been right there when the camera clicked. Sometimes I'd ask myself if maybe I was overthinking it, if maybe I was paranoid, but deep down I knew better. Too many times, too many accidents, too many silences. This was not about mistakes. This was about a family that had already decided I didn't fit the picture. There's a particular kind of anger that builds when you're erased over and over, and it's not loud or explosive at first. It's quiet, the kind of anger that simmers low for years until one day you realize you don't just want acknowledgement anymore. You want proof, undeniable proof, that you were here, that you mattered, and that they cannot keep pretending otherwise. That realization didn't hit me all at once, but it was growing inside me with every family photo I wasn't in, every forgotten invite, every shrug when I brought it up. I remember sitting in my car one Thanksgiving, scrolling through the group photos they had just posted, and seeing myself once again on the edge, half of my face blurred and cropped. That was the moment it became crystal clear to me. They were never going to put me in the picture. They liked me erased. They wanted the family narrative without me in it. And something inside me shifted that night. I didn't cry, and I didn't call anyone to complain. Instead, I thought, fine. If they won't include me, I'll find my own way to make sure they can't erase me. That thought sat with me for weeks, and by the time Christmas came around again, I wasn't bracing myself anymore. I was planning. Because this year, I wasn't going to wait for them to forget me again. I had something in mind, and they weren't going to see it coming. After that Thanksgiving in the car when I stared at my half-face on their feed and felt something inside me stop asking for permission to be seen, I went back to my life and did the one thing that never asked for anyone's approval, which was work that I built with my own hands and my own judgment, and while they filled group chats with birthday cakes and promotions that would barely make an HR memo, I was stacking quiet wins that did not need confetti to be real, landing my first real clients, negotiating rates without apologizing, swallowing the days that felt like I was pushing a stalled car uphill, and then tasting the rush when it finally rolled. And I told myself I would not go looking for applause from people who were busy cropping me out of pictures. Because applause from that crowd came with strings that always tied me into a smaller version of myself. The funny part is that success, even the early kind that is more sweat than celebration, loves clarity, and with every deal that actually closed, with every invoice paid on time, with every referral that came back around because I had done what I said I would do, I felt clearer about who I was than I had in years, yet when I tried to share any of it, even casually, I ran into that familiar family fog where everyone hears what they want and edits the rest, like the time I told my mother I had signed a contract that made me feel like I had finally crossed a line from trying to doing, and she nodded and asked if I had thought about applying for a job with benefits because my cousin had just started at a place with free snacks and a gym membership, which she said in that voice that tells you what she values without saying it outright. I kept my mouth mostly shut after that, not because I was ashamed of what I was building, but because I was tired of feeling like the person who shows up with a cake and watches them scrape off the frosting before anyone even picks up a fork. And when a local business journal ran a small piece on what I was doing, which was not flashy but was honest and accurate, I dropped the link in the family chat with a simple line that said I thought Grandma might like to read it, and then I watched the message sit there while they discussed Aunt Carol's new patio furniture and a cousin's dog who had learned a trick, and by the time someone finally tapped a thumbs up, the moment had evaporated and I realized it had never existed for them in the first place. There were little tests I gave them that I did not announce, and I am not proud of how petty they sound in hindsight, but they were the kind of experiments you run when your gut keeps telling you a story and you want a data point to back it up. So I sent the family a folder of photos from a niece's recital that I had taken and edited with care, making sure I was in a handful of them only because I had actually been there and someone had asked me into the frame, and later that week those photos showed up online again, now tighter, cleaner, and missing me altogether, and the comments said how sweet it was to have the whole family together, and I stared at that sentence until it became absurd. At some point the anger that had been simmering changed shape, settling into something more focused, and I decided that if they wanted a neat story where I simply did not exist, then for once I would write a story they could not rewrite with a crop tool. And before I even knew the final move I wanted, I started with something small but deliberate, which was to collect the original versions of a decade's worth of family photos that I still had on my phone or could retrieve from people who had sent them to me. The ones where I had been standing at the edge or seated in the back or just barely visible, because I had been there and I was tired of pretending I had not. I took those images and had them printed without edits, not enlarged to shout but big enough to be undeniable, and I assembled them into a single frame that laid out our family as it actually was, messy and misaligned and yet complete. And I added a tiny engraved line at the bottom that simply said all of us were there, which was not poetry and not an accusation, just a fact that had been treated like an opinion for too long, and I scheduled it to be delivered to Grandma's house the morning of Sunday lunch when everyone would be around, and then I showed up early because I knew if I asked for permission the answer would be a version of no. When they walked in and saw the frame hanging exactly where last year's cropped collage used to sit, there was this long stretch of silence that sounded like a dial tone, and then the question started. Not about the photos themselves, but about my choice to put them there without asking, and I said, in a voice that surprised even me with how steady it came out, that I was done negotiating my existence, and that the only thing I had done was correct the record so that when anyone looked back, they would see what actually happened instead of a version edited for comfort, and Grandma stood close enough for me to hear her whisper that the line was true and that she had always known it, and I believed her, even if I also knew she had never said it out loud when it would have helped. I did not linger to debate or gather a consensus or wait for them to say good job, because I had learned that praise offered under pressure curdles fast, so I hugged Grandma, said I would call her later. And I walked out with the smallest smile that comes when you do something that cost you nerves, but bought you dignity, and by that night the group chat was on fire with words like dramatic and unnecessary and attention-seeking. And Grandma sent me a private message that said she would keep the frame up as long as she could, which told me everything I needed to know about how the next week would go, and while they argued about whether my correction counted as an attack, I opened my laptop and began looking for something they could not quietly take down on a weekday afternoon, something they could not crop, something they would have to drive past every single day until it sank in, because if a frame on a wall could be lifted, then the next correction would have to be impossible to miss and impossible to remove, and as soon as I saw the location that would make them stop pretending, I knew exactly whose street it had to be. When the local business journal piece was published, I thought maybe, just maybe, someone from my family would finally break the silence, but the quiet that followed was louder than any insult I could have imagined, because they all saw it, they all knew it was there. Yet nobody said a single word, not a call, not a message, not even one of those dry, two-word texts that usually get sent when someone in the family stubs a toe or gets a new coffee maker. I told myself not to care, but that's the kind of lie you tell when your stomach is twisted and your chest is tight, because the truth is that you always care when the silence comes from the people who should be proud of you. I had already gone through the routine of pretending it didn't matter, but this time, something inside me snapped in a way that was different, calmer, almost surgical, as if my frustration had shifted into strategy. I knew that if I wanted to change the narrative, I would need to do something so undeniable, so public and so permanent that they would not be able to erase me no matter how badly they wanted to. It was around that time when my name appeared on a Forbes list. It wasn't the biggest one, not the one people plaster on LinkedIn with champagne bottles and confetti, but it was legitimate, recognized, and above all, official. I read the email twice, then 3 times, thinking maybe it was a mistake, but it wasn't. I remember sitting back and laughing, not because it was funny, but because I already knew what was going to happen next, or rather, what wasn't going to happen. The family group chat stayed quiet. The phone didn't buzz with congratulations. There was no proud repost on Facebook. Nothing. They had ignored birthdays, graduations, first jobs, but I thought maybe this would be too big for them to brush aside. Instead, they did exactly what I should have expected. They treated it like it hadn't happened at all. That was the moment the idea of the billboard came to me, and it didn't start as a lightning bolt of genius. It started as a joke in my own head. I imagined slapping my face on the side of a building with a caption that said, "Still forgotten," just to see what would happen, and I laughed to myself, because the picture was ridiculous and yet so perfect. But the more I thought about it, the less ridiculous it became, and soon I wasn't laughing anymore. I was calculating. I started researching billboard rentals like a person who already knew this was going to happen, scrolling through available spots in my hometown, making calls, asking about prices, and I could feel the idea settling into my bones like it was something I had been waiting to do for years. Then I found it. There was a billboard on the main road that ran right past Grandma's street, the same street where the family always drove when they came to visit her. The same street that had carried every cousin's birthday banners tied to lampposts and every congratulatory yard sign for graduations. The same street that had hosted endless parades of recognition, just not for me. I stared at the listing for that billboard like it was a dare, because I knew if I put my face up there, they would have no choice but to see me. They couldn't crop me out, they couldn't cut me off the edge, and they couldn't pretend I wasn't there. I signed the paperwork, wired the money, and sent over the design file to the ad company without even blinking, and in that design was the picture they had never given me, my face, my name, and underneath it, the line that made me grin when I typed it out. Guess who made Forbes? It was petty, yes, but it was also perfect, because it was sharp enough to sting and simple enough that even they couldn't twist it into something else. I chose those words carefully because they carried all the weight of years of silence wrapped in one sentence. It was not a brag for strangers, not a marketing ploy for my business. It was a direct message to the people who had spent their lives pretending I didn't count. When I clicked send on the final confirmation email, I sat back and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a mixture of nerves and satisfaction, like standing on the edge of a cliff with your arms open. Knowing the fall will be terrifying, but the leap is yours alone. I thought about Grandma, who had never outright defended me but also never joined in the erasure, who always sat quietly while others laughed about me being dramatic. I thought about how she would feel driving down her own street and seeing me 10 feet tall with words that could not be ignored. I wondered if she would smile, or if she would just sigh and say it was unnecessary, but either way, it would be there, staring back at her, proof that I was not invisible. The closer the installation date came, the less I cared about what their reaction would be. I wasn't doing this for their praise. I was doing it to settle something inside myself. I had spent too many years waiting for scraps of acknowledgement, begging for a place in a family story that never wanted me, and I was finished waiting. The Billboard wasn't about revenge in the cartoonish sense. It was about rewriting the story, about putting myself so firmly in the picture that nobody could ever crop me out again. And as I went to bed the night before it was scheduled to go up, I couldn't help but think, tomorrow, when they drive to Grandma's, they'll see me. They'll all see me. And for the first time in my life, they won't be able to look away. The morning it went up, I was already awake before the call from the installer came through, not because I was jittery or chasing some dramatic moment, but because I had made a decision that finally matched the size of the problem. And when he said it was live and I could come take a look, I did what any normal person would do and took the long way over, because I wanted to feel the build in my chest without pretending it was anything other than what it was. And when I turned onto Grandma's street and saw my face and my name and that single line stretched across the sky where nobody in that family could crop or minimize or misremember, I did not cry and I did not gloat. I just let the relief land with the heaviness it deserved. Because for the first time in a long time, the facts of my life were louder than the family version of them. The design looked exactly the way I had sent it, which mattered less for aesthetics and more for accuracy, because this was not a mood board and it was not an ad campaign. It was a record that could not be rewritten, my name spelled the way I spell it. The recognition spelled the way they spelled it, and beneath it the sentence that read like a dare and a smile at the same time, and I stood there long enough to watch a handful of cars slow down and then speed back up, which told me everything. About how uncomfortable people get when you put the truth somewhere they cannot scroll past, and I laughed in my car because it felt good to know that even if they avoided the conversation, they could not avoid the road. By noon the text started. Not congratulations, never those, but the kind of messages people send when they want to sound principled while protecting their own feelings. So my aunt wrote that it was not appropriate to use Grandma's street for self-promotion. My brother wrote that it was funny, but a little much. A cousin I had not heard from in years sent a screenshot with the caption, "Bold move," and the group chat tried to convert it into a debate about tone, which is what families do when they run out of facts, and while they were doing that, my phone was blowing up with messages from people I actually worked with who had driven past and honked, and then typed out the one thing my family never says, which was that they were proud of me. And I let myself feel those words like water, because they were real and clean and cost nobody anything. Grandma did not text, which I expected, because she never writes when she can call, and when she did call, she did not ask me why I did it or tell me to take it down. She just said my full name the way only she does and told me she had already seen it twice and that she would be making a pot of coffee if I wanted to stop by later. And I could hear the soft insistence in her voice that said she had things she wanted to say without an audience, and I told her I would come by, not immediately. Because I wanted the day to belong to the Billboard and not to a summit, but later, because I owed her honesty even if she had never risked much of hers for me. The online reaction arrived before dinner, which was expected and still a little absurd, because people who had ignored a decade of my work found time to write paragraphs about humility and family values. And one of my cousins tried to weaponize the town Facebook group by posting that I was embarrassing grandma, and then he got the kind of replies you cannot plant. Neighbors and old teachers and people who remembered me babysitting their kids chiming in to say that recognition is not arrogance. When it comes after years of silence, and while I do not live for comment sections, I will admit that reading those felt like standing in a room where the air finally matched the truth. The family tried a different angle in the evening, pivoting from tone to logistics, because logistics are how you suffocate a decision without admitting you hate it. So my mother asked how much it cost, my uncle asked who designed it. And someone floated the idea that maybe the company had made a mistake and I could ask for a partial refund in exchange for a shorter run. And I wrote back that the contract was paid in full and the timeline was set and that there was nothing to discuss because it was not a negotiation but a notice, which landed like a slammed door even though I said it calmly. And after that the chat quieted into the kind of sulk that always shows up when a woman refuses to apologize for taking up room that is hers. I told myself I would not let them turn this into a fight I had already won, so I shut my laptop and drove back to the Billboard as the day thinned out, not to admire it like a trophy, but to remind myself that this was not about a sign. It was about making the inside of my head match the outside of my life, and as I sat there watching the evening traffic slow, I realized that the victory was not that they had to look at me, it was that I no longer needed them to look at me to feel real, and the quiet piece of that thought surprised me more than the sign ever could. Then, just before I left, the email from the ad company slid into my inbox with a subject line that looked harmless until I opened it and saw that someone had called them insisting the creative violated trademark and family privacy, offering to buy out the remaining weeks at double the rate if they replaced my billboard immediately with a neutral message, and the name on the inquiry was not a stranger or a competitor or even the cousin who loves a petty campaign. It was a person who should have been the first to clap, and while I sat with that, my phone rang again, and it was my mother, not typing this time, asking me to come by because there was something I needed to hear before I decided how to answer that email. Something she should have said years ago but did not, and the way she said my name told me that the billboard had moved more than traffic. When my mother asked me to come by, I hesitated, not because I was afraid of what she might say, but because I already knew that stepping into her house after the billboard went up would not be the same as it had been before. That whatever was waiting for me would carry the weight of years of silence finally breaking, and I needed to decide whether I was ready to hear the words she had never offered when they could have mattered most. I drove anyway, slowly, because part of me wanted to stretch the space between the sign and the conversation, but eventually I parked, walked in, and found her at the kitchen table with a look that was neither angry nor proud, but something in between. Like a person who had been caught between two truths for so long she no longer knew which one she believed. She started talking before I even sat down, saying that she had seen the billboard herself that morning, that she had heard the whispers from neighbors, that she had read the messages in the group chat, and that she understood why I did it, even if she would never admit that to the others, because she knew what it felt like to be invisible in this family, and hearing her say that nearly made me laugh, because it was so simple and so late, and yet it was the one thing I had wanted to hear from her all along. She admitted that she had gone along with the family's habits because it was easier to stay quiet than to be the one who disrupted the narrative, that she had chosen silence in moments when she should have spoken up, that she had watched me disappear from photos and stories and had told herself it was harmless even as she knew it wasn't. And for a second I just sat there staring at her because I didn't know whether to be relieved that she was finally honest or furious that she had chosen this moment, after the fact, after the years, after the billboard, to say it. I listened, though, because as much as I wanted to cut her off and tell her it was too late, I knew that hearing her wrestle with her own guilt was part of the revenge, not the flashy part, but the quiet, permanent part that lives in someone's chest after the dust settles. She said she was proud of me, she said she had always been proud of me, but that pride had been buried under family politics and old patterns she had been too weak to fight, and as she said those words, I realized she wasn't just explaining, She was asking for forgiveness she wasn't sure she deserved. I didn't give her forgiveness, not really, but I didn't deny it either. I told her that pride spoken in private after years of public silence was like giving water to a person who had already learned to live thirsty, that it was better than nothing, but it wasn't what I had needed. And I think she understood that because she didn't argue. She just nodded, and we sat there in the kind of silence that isn't empty but thick with everything that could have been different. I left not long after, and when I stepped back outside and saw the faint glow of the billboard at the edge of the sky, I realized I didn't need her words anymore. They were fine to have but not essential. Because the victory had already been claimed the moment I forced them all to look. The days that followed were strange, because the family split into factions without ever admitting it out loud. Some doubled down on their outrage, saying I had humiliated everyone, made Grandma uncomfortable, disrespected traditions, and others stayed quiet in that guilty way that tells you they see the point but don't have the courage to say it. While a few cousins I had barely spoken to in years sent me private messages saying they thought it was brilliant, that they wished they had the guts to do something similar in their own lives, and one even confessed that she had once been told to crop me out of a photo before posting it, but hadn't wanted to, and she apologized for doing it anyway. Those messages mattered more than I expected, not because they erased the past, but because they confirmed that the silence had never been neutral. It had been a choice, and now those choices looked a lot uglier when held up against a billboard nobody could ignore. Grandma called me 2 days later. She didn't say much, just that she had seen the sign again when she walked to get her mail, and that she wanted me to know she left it there on purpose, which meant she could have asked for it to be removed, and she hadn't. And in that short call I heard more support than in a lifetime of cropped-up photos. It wasn't loud or public, but it was real, and I took it as a kind of truce between us, a quiet acknowledgement that, even if she never defended me before, she would not stand in the way of my victory now. That was enough. Looking back, I realized the billboard was never really about proving something to them, not entirely. It was about proving something to myself, that I could stop waiting to be written into their story and instead write my own headline, that I could decide the scale and the tone of my own recognition without needing anyone else's permission. When I first imagined it, I thought the revenge would be seeing their faces when they drove past and realizing they couldn't crop me out anymore, but the deeper satisfaction came later, when I understood that I didn't actually care what they thought once it was up. Because the point wasn't their applause, it was my freedom from needing it. And maybe that is why, even now, I don't feel like I went too far. I feel like I finally went far enough. They will keep telling their version of things, they will keep reshaping the story to suit themselves, but there will always be this one undeniable fact written across the sky on the street they cannot avoid. For once, I wasn't cropped out, I wasn't forgotten. And they were forced to see me exactly as I am. That alone was worth everything. And while I don't know how the family will handle me from here on out, I do know one thing: I don't need them to handle me at all, because I already made sure the world knows I exist, and no amount of silence can erase a billboard that big.